on this episode of 2036, the podcast.
I tell students to think about themselves as fearlessly engaging in multiple modalities of music making and music study. So it's true that you have to have a primary identity, maybe. I'm a violinist. But the sooner that you embrace that you can also be an improvising jazz violinist, or you can be a composer, or you can be an arranger or a conductor, the sooner you will experience the sort of diverse portfolio of success that can come to someone who doesn't try to narrowly define themselves. And that's something that I'm very proud to say that at Emory, we really value that, and we really encourage students to do things that cut across these subdisciplines.
Welcome to 2036, the podcast. I'm Ken Carter, professor of psychology at Emory University's Oxford College, and I'm here today with Paul Bacine. Paul Bacine is the interim department chair for the Emory University Department of Music. He is the director of orchestral studies, conductor for the Emory University Symphony Orchestra, music director for the Emory Youth Symphony Orchestra, and holds the inaugural Donna and Marvin Schwartz Professorship in Music. Bacine is also an accomplished orchestral trumpet player who composes, records, teaches, and conducts. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So you grew up in a multicultural home filled with music, but not classical music. Can you describe the music that surrounded you as a child and the effect it had on your musical development?
Well, I grew up in the greater New York City tri-state area and was born in Queens, New York. And so the kind of diverse musical influence in my household was not uncommon in that part of New York because it was a very richly diverse and mixed households were not uncommon. So in my house, on the Puerto Rican side, my mother was Puerto Rican, you would have Hector Lavoe or you would have Javier Solís and other traditional and popular Latin American music that was really sort of making its impact in New York at that time, or a lot of Puerto Ricans living in New York in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and obviously still now. But then on my father's side, he was born in Bombay, and so we would simultaneously in a different part of the house be listening to Sikh bhajans and sort of vintage Bollywood soundtracks from the 40s and 50s, very loudly too. There was always a sort of the sense I had where maybe they were competing with each other with the volume button just to really crank things up. And so as a child, before I was drawn into Western classical music, I was constantly enveloped in completely different musical vocabularies.
Do you remember what the sort of emotional effect that music had on you when you were a kid?
Well, I sometimes slept over my friends' houses when I was 8 or 9, and as a first generation American, I didn't know what other children's lives were like when they woke up, but it wasn't, full-throated singing of Bollywood soundtracks from 1948 at 7 in the morning. And so I think emotionally, it wasn't long before I started to develop an appreciation and a sort of a kind of quiet reverence for how unusual my household was at that time in comparison to others. And I think that reverence over time changed and sort of coalesced around a broader love and affection for the kind of musical home that I grew up in.
Yeah. And so when did you first start playing music yourself? Your instrument's the trumpet, but what led you to that?
Well, it was important to my parents that I engage in the fine arts, and they didn't know exactly what shape that would take, what form that would take, because they weren't musicians in the Western tradition at all. But my mother's brother was a trumpeter, just recreational, and he owned a trumpet. And so I had to save up enough money to buy that trumpet if I wanted to try it out. And so after I had achieved that financial goal. And for $100, I bought the trumpet, I took it home, and he gave me a cassette tape, my uncle, of the famous trumpeter Wynton Marsalis, who at the time had just won a Grammy simultaneously for both classical and jazz. And so that recording, the sound of the instrument really made me, it had an unforgettable effect on me. I could not get it out of my head. And so every time I played the instrument, I really wanted to make that sound. And I sought out instruction. And because he played jazz, I also was somehow recruited into what I think of as a quintessentially American musical enterprise. I was recruited into a Boy Scout troop where the only detail for eligibility was that you had to be able to improvise on a jazz instrument.
Okay.
I know it sounds crazy, but there was this incredible Boy Scout troop. At that time, we had moved to New Jersey for high school. And the Boy Scout troop, you had to audition as a jazz musician. And if you were in the Boy Scout troop, the entire membership was a big band.
Wow.
And that was their way of performing and having public-facing events for veterans, for in the community, at retirement homes. And it was a really great exposure for me and for others to experience a sort of service learning
Right.
Structure for young people who maybe didn't know the different ways that music can enrich and bolster a community around an institution.
So how old were you around that time?
I was around 12. So I'd been playing the instrument for 1 year maybe, and it came easily to me at that young age, at least at the level needed to join this Boy Scout jazz band. And I loved it. And every day that went by, I fell in love with it more. But then around 14, my classical trumpet teacher encouraged me to audition for youth symphonies. So I started playing in orchestras, and the most sort of formative one, there's a high school orchestra at Tanglewood where the Boston Symphony makes their home in the summer. And that's where I, for the first time, played really major symphonic works on the trumpet. Wow. And that was around 15, 16. And that is when it completely hypnotized me in a happy way where I only wanted to make that kind of music.
Wow. I want to go back just a second to the Boy Scout because I want to have an understanding of it's one thing to play an instrument and play music that you're seeing in front of you. It's another to improvise with a group of other individuals, especially around the age of 12. What do you think, like what was that like, and what do you think you learned from that experience?
Well, I'll start with the end. I'll say that across university curricula in this country now, whether it's in professional schools of music or liberal arts departments of music, there's a lot of attention being paid to the way that we theorize music and we teach music theory. And one of the things that really strikes me as fortunate, this Boy Scout jazz band experience I had, is that for the last 15, 20 years, incorporating improvisation as a mode of theorizing music has become more and more popular in the formal study of music at the college level. And looking back to that time, my first formal teacher of trumpet was not a trumpeter. He was a jazz pianist. And so our lessons didn't have much to do with trumpet. It was more, you have to listen to this Miles Davis solo, and then you have to play it back to me to sort of learn some of the gestures and some of the improvisatory instincts that the greats had. Then he would accompany me at the piano and play chord changes, and I would have to learn how to play the 12-bar blues and then the minor blues, and then we'd have to do different forms. And I never thought about it as being unusual. I thought this was what everyone did in their music lessons. And I didn't realize until later that learning how to compose and perform simultaneously under pressure is something that really can help students of music to find their creative voice in a really lasting way.
It's incredible. Now, when you were in college, you started conducting for the first time. What was that like?
Well, I didn't spend a lot of time conducting ensembles necessarily, but I would say in college, I got my first taste of leading rehearsals with chamber ensembles. So if I was in a mixed chamber group with winds, strings, percussion, or maybe a brass quintet or something small, if I was leading the rehearsal, it was incumbent upon me to try to unify the musical goals of the group. And that was my first taste of trying to organize everyone's musical ideas, trying to encourage everyone's musical ideas and make them feel like they belonged and were valued, but also simultaneously preparing a group of musicians for a public performance and finding order in all of that. And I really enjoyed it.
I mean, it feels like there's something sort of similar about a group of people sort of coming together and playing the same kind of music, but also being able to have that conductor that's there to bring it all together. Are there different philosophies of conducting, and what might yours be?
Oh, absolutely. There's a sort of autocratic tradition from Western Europe that was kind of imported to the United States in the first half of the 20th century. And some of these styles of conducting, if you think about famous conductors like Toscanini or Bruno Walter and these kinds of famous old world conductors who were the boss in all things all the time. Whereas in the last 50 years, since Leonard Bernstein and others, the idea of the musical boss started to be more inclusive of a sort of servant leadership where you're embracing and actually encouraging the musical and artistic voices of the musicians that you're working with. And the idea behind that is that an ensemble that feels encouraged to contribute and that their own original interpretations are also part of what's happening in an indelible way, that group will play better. It'll play more reliably, it'll play more beautifully, but most importantly, the effect of that is felt and heard by the audience.
Now, you also compose as well. So if you like, and what is that like for you?
Well, my composing work is mostly in the film arena. And so I've composed several film scores. And for me, I think it can be traced back to my improvising days as a jazz musician, because when you're a jazz improviser, melodies just occur to you sometimes, or textures, or combinations of instruments. These are things that are very natural for jazz improvisers, but not as common for a classical musician who's has to be focused on playing really perfectly a lot of the time. And that sort of embracing of an openness to the natural imperfections that happen when you're improvising, I think that also frees you as a composer to try different things and not really approach it with vulnerability or doubt, but just experimentation and trust and enjoyment. And so I think that that really informs when I sit down to write some music. I think about what it feels like to improvise, and it helps me.
Yeah, it seems like you've got these different pieces of your creativity that you're using, performing, composing, conducting. Do you feel like they use different parts of yourself?
Well, one thing I tell students often is that as musicians, even though sometimes at a university we're trained to be very narrow, because a lot of modes of research and knowledge creation, I think, are geared towards asking a very specific research question, outlining a very specific methodology to answer that question, and then trying to make a contribution that's very specific and could be contextualized in a broader temporal trajectory. But for an artist who is doing work or learning or making music at the university level, I tell students to think about themselves as fearlessly engaging in multiple modalities of music making and music study. And so I tell them that each of these different modalities informs and supports the other. So it's true that you have to have a primary identity, maybe, as a musician. I'm a violinist. But the sooner that you embrace that you can also be an improvising jazz violinist, or you can be a composer, or you can be an arranger or a conductor. The sooner you will experience the sort of diverse portfolio of success that can come to someone who doesn't try to narrowly define themselves. And that's something that I'm very proud to say that at Emory, we really value that, and we really encourage students to do things that cut across these subdisciplines.
So you are the inaugural Donna and Marvin Schwartz Professor of Music. You conduct the Emory University Symphony Orchestra and the Emory Youth Symphony Orchestra. You also serve as a music director for the Atlanta Chamber Music Festival. So what inspires you about working with young musicians?
That's a great question. I remember some of the first experiences I had playing as a young musician in high school, or even in college to a certain degree, but mostly in high school. And I remember how it felt the first time I played a Mahler symphony in the orchestra, or the first time I improvised a solo relatively successfully on a bandstand. And I tell the students that, and I tell the community when asked that question, that I feel like it's my obligation as an academic and as a university faculty member to treat what we do on campus here and what I do in my professional activity. I feel it's my obligation to support the community in which I live, to support the community in which my institution resides. And part of that means sort of thinking about the university as less of a shining edifice on the hill and more of like a public park. Or like a place that exists exclusively for the betterment of society. And the more immediate that betterment is, and the more immediate the impact the institution can have, the better. So working with young musicians, I want them to experience that same satisfaction and pleasure and sometimes healthy failure that comes as a young musician, but under the guidance of someone who sees it as their obligation to provide that experience for them, to help them.
Yeah. And so what are those experiences like that healthy failure help them with outside of that musical realm?
Well, last night we had a concert at Emerson Hall at the Schwartz Center with the Youth Symphony. And the Youth Symphony is composed of about 100 high school-aged orchestral musicians. And they are selected from about 375 who audition every fall. And many of these students ultimately apply and attend Emory. But what I told them on the podium before the concert was that this is the only time in their lives that they're quite literally asking to be a part of healthy failure. And I tell them that, yes, playing the right notes at the right time and in a beautiful way, that's the goal. But to me, the more important goal is that they let go of self-doubt and self-critique, and that they embrace the idea that if they apply things that they're learning, there'll be a certain degree of crudity that precedes mastery. And this is the time in their life that they should let go of wanting to be seen by their peers as masters, because they're not. And I tell them that I wish someone had told me that when I was their age, because I would have been less nervous. I would have been less scared of being seen as less than. And really importantly, I tell them this is just one step along a process for you. And if you're doing everything right, you should miss a few notes because you're getting better at things you don't know how to do yet. And when a student walked off the stage, the concert went really well. But when a student walked off the stage, I said, I hope that resonated with you. And he said to me, well, we're students after all. And I thought, I can't tell if he's sort of letting me know that I was saying something unnecessary or not. But I think it did make an impact. And it really fills me with a lot of satisfaction to try to help these students in this fantastic region that we live in, where music education is so strong. Your average music program in a high school here in Metro Atlanta is so accomplished. And so I'm very lucky to support the work of these music educators here on campus. And strengthening that connection.
So you have a lot of different musical interests, but chamber music really stands out. So what do you love about chamber music?
Chamber music is a smaller, unconducted experience. So some people wonder, why is a conductor the music director of this chamber music festival? But some of my formative experiences as a young musician were in these smaller chamber groups where, through a democratic process, often nonverbal, you have to find a way to craft an original interpretation of a piece while recognizing everyone's valued and sovereign points of view. And there's no better way for a teenager, I think, who has really strong opinions and thinks they know everything, to be in a room with 5 other teenagers who feel exactly the same way. And through those rehearsals in my student days, I had to give up a part of my certitude that I was right about everything and embrace that multiple right things can simultaneously be present. And I learned that the struggle and the scariness of sort of giving up some of your held musical beliefs in service of something more communal was a powerful lesson. And so one of the reasons I focus on chamber music at the festival, and the reason I think it's so great, is I feel like our society needs more of that. Mm-hmm. And if I can play a part in fostering that, then I've done some good thing.
And what about for the audience? What do you feel like audiences get from that experience with chamber music?
I think it's electrifying to watch people communicate without talking and just by a slight physical gesture or movement or a breath that's slightly different than the one you did before, or perhaps a kind of a glance or a sort of kinesthetic invisible energy that they emanate from the stage. I feel like a lot of times for students, the way that we consume information and media, the expectation is that you're not going to engage with this content for more than 7 seconds. So we'll presume that if it's 6 minutes long, you're probably not going to watch to the end. But what I try to do in my work with chamber musicians is to have them embrace the idea that if they do it at a high level, then it will teach themselves, but also the audience, that there is an incredible payoff if you can develop the sort of the patience to experience a artistic presentation of something over more than just 30 seconds or 1 minute.
Right.
In the same way, great literature or great theater or great dance has this payoff, but it requires cultivating the ability to digest over periods of time these ideas. And I don't think there's a lot of reward in that in the internet space when it comes to a lot of the things young people are consuming right now. It's more focused on sort of immediacy and immediate impact oftentimes, not always. Right. But this is something that takes away the talking and sometimes the planning even, and lets it be so live and so unscripted, but also over a long form, which is pretty unique for them.
So I feel like what I'm hearing too is that there's a difference between listening to a chamber performance versus experiencing it in person, because there's some visual things, there are other kinds of things to listen for and to watch for. So do you think that so if it's been a while since I've seen a chamber performance in person, what should I look for the next time I'm there?
You know, a good analogy might be film. I feel like there was a period of time in filmmaking in America in particular where the exposition, the expository dialogue or a scene or whatever it may be, it was pretty long sometimes to really set you up. It's not necessarily like that now. But when you see a film made now with a very pronounced expository introduction, it feels like you're watching something out of a time machine. And in music, I would say that if you already know the composer to a degree and maybe even you know the piece, then you will be able to, just as you can watch Henry V with different actors, and you'll be able to pick up on the subtle and not subtle changes in the delivery and the interpretation of the dialogue and the lines. You could do that with chamber music. But if you don't know the composer and you don't know the music at all, then I think the important thing is to watch and observe how these tiny, seemingly, very subtle gestures, impulses, messages that the musicians are sharing back and forth. See if you can pick up how great an impact they make on the musical product. And even if you just pick up on one or two, it will make you want to see more of it.
Wow. No, I can't wait. I feel like I'm going to have a fresh experience this next time.
Well, I'll encourage all of our listeners to go to the Emory Chamber Music Society, which has been for decades producing incredible chamber music concerts right here on campus. And I personally look forward to them for the very reasons you just mentioned.
So you've mentioned that a performance at Emery Schwartz Center is an extraordinary event. What makes that venue so special?
Well, as a conductor, I'll give you some technical details, and then maybe I'll share some of the bigger picture considerations. When you're conducting a large ensemble, it's really important that the members of the ensemble can hear each other in a neutral acoustic that provides a little support with some reverberation and richness in the sound, but it doesn't come at the expense of being able to hear 60 feet away on the other side of the stage. So when the students at Emory take the stage in Emerson Hall, they're treated to a first-class acoustic experience on stage that allows them to listen across and between one another to facilitate those nonverbal communication moments, which are impossible if you can't hear everyone clearly. Beyond that, the construction of the stage and the risers and the sort of positioning of where people are able to sit is a very traditional model based on the Musikverein in Vienna. And it's very effective in sort of layering and texturing the orchestral sound, where certain instruments are kind of enveloped in a blanket of warmth when they need to be. Other instruments are brilliant and searing when they need to be. And as a conductor, it helps me to build a kind of customized portrait for each piece based upon all of these sonic capsules that are presented on stage. But in the audience, the sound is just incredible. It's powerful and nimble. It's athletic and transparent simultaneously. It is detailed, but also grand and expansive. And that can only be achieved in a first-rate acoustically tuned hall that is designed for orchestral and symphonic, choral, just large ensemble music making. And it's every time I get on stage, it feels like the first time because it's so rewarding.
Wow. Have any different performances sort of stood out for you there?
Yes. After the pandemic, when we first were able to take the stage, which was very hard for us in the University Symphony because the very thing we do was the only thing that was expressly prohibited. Congregate activity, close together. And so when we were finally received the green light to come back together, I thought it was important to recognize all of Emory's healthcare workers who bore the brunt of a lot of what was happening to our society. And so we had our first concert back. We performed the Adagietto from Mahler Symphony No. 5 in honor of those healthcare workers. And listening after 21 months apart, all those student musicians come together, but sharing something in recognition and acknowledgement of a sort of often invisible force for good and try to make them visible that day. I feel like the sound of that music in the hall took on a greater meaning. And I think the students and the audience, certainly I, will always remember it.
So you're a performer, a composer, a conductor, and an educator. How does your position at Emory allow you to pursue these sometimes conflicting passions?
Well, what I love about being at Emory and being an academic musician is that success as an academic often is tied to your ability to achieve excellence as a teacher, as a researcher, also in service to your department, your college, your university, your discipline. And what's great about the performing arts is that all of the interests that I have and all of the professional off-campus work that I do, they can all be brought back to campus for the betterment of the students and the institution. So an example would be if I'm composing a film score and the Gene Siskel Center in Chicago says, we'd like to premiere your film. Being at Emory allows me to take a 20-person cohort from the university orchestra to perform that film score at the Siskel Center. That's not something that you can just make happen on your own. And everyone benefits. Or if the principal musicians of the Atlanta Symphony want to partner with me to record a CD of unusual concertos for their instrument and orchestra, we have this incredible concert hall. And we have students and professional faculty who can collaborate with me to make it happen. So I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that the university is like this artistic laboratory that rewards and encourages creation. And I consider it a great I consider myself greatly fortunate that I get to work in this environment where the things I'm interested in also fortify the institution and the students. So it's true that sometimes they're conflicting, but mainly most are just in my schedule, that if I'm composing something, I often feel like I should be looking at a score for what I'm conducting that night, because I don't want to open the score and look at it and try to remember, what is this piece? But I find that all these things can be held in tension simultaneously. And I like the feeling of sort of engaging in that space on a daily basis.
You've described the role of music at Emory as a co-equal discipline and vector of knowledge creation amongst all the disciplines on campus that we teach and study. Can you talk a little bit more about the role that music plays in people's academic and personal lives?
Absolutely. The creation of music and the preparing of people to play or compose or teach music, it's usually the province of the professional music school. Because the idea is that if you want to be a professional performer or a professional doctor or lawyer, you go to that professional school to learn those skills. Mm-hmm. But at Emory, we treat the creation of music on stage or in the composition studio or the electronic music studio, we treat the creation of music as the creation of knowledge. And so that is how performance and some of these other generative modes of scholarship in the arts, that is how they are co-equal disciplines with a seat at the table amongst all the other arts, sciences, and humanities at Emory. And what I'm really proud of is that Emory openly embraces it. Whereas there are some institutions where music performance is seen maybe as extracurricular or something students do sometimes alongside or as an enrichment opportunity, or maybe something they do after their other classes. But here at Emory, it is one of the classes. It is one of the pillars of the academic temple, so to speak. And when the students engage in these activities, I think that they can feel the rigor of it, which sort of kind of rhymes or resonates with the same energy of a professional school, but with the openness and the experimentation and the freedom that comes with a liberal arts education. And combining those things is something that I work very hard to do, but it wouldn't be able to happen at another institution. And it makes Emory, I think, really unique amongst our peers. And I think that's why we've become a real destination for young, creative people.
Right. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
To learn more about 2036, Emory's campaign to transform the future, visit 2036.emory.edu.